5 reasons why Alice Cooper owns Halloween. Number 1, he was an innovator. He was a complete innovator. He says that he drove the stake through the heart of the peace and love generation, not too far off the map. I mean, if you look at the stuff that was going on at that time, especially in San Francisco, and he's coming from Detroit and he's doing something completely different. They started out in L.A., Phoenix, and then L.A., and then they actually went to Detroit because they felt it was more of a rock and roll town, and they worked on their sound and their image and everything. Came back super strong and really got on the map as far as people knowing about them. Once they started working with Bob Ezrin and put out albums on Warner Brothers, the first one being Love It to Death. Look at the title. But yeah, he was doing something completely different. Created the legend around him and the band, wore the eye makeup, was violent on stage, or had this dark kind of undercurrent to the lyrics, and was really kind of bringing that to the forefront when nobody else was doing it. He made the show an event, more of a concept thing, and less of just a band playing rock and roll on stage or boring people to death with maybe too much of the peace and love stuff that maybe worn out its welcome by that time. Number 2, the stories. There are so many stories about Alice Cooper. I mean, he supposedly got his name or their name from a Ouija board. And that may not be true. I think the reality is they just like the name Alice Cooper. It sounded super wholesome, and what better name to have for 5 dudes playing rock and roll and, kind of exposing the dark undercurrents of society and singing about things that people didn't normally sing about. Alice Cooper. It sounds super innocent. There's a chicken incident in Detroit where he threw it. He doesn't know that chickens don't fly. He's from Detroit. Somebody throws a chicken on stage, he throws it back, it gets ripped to pieces, it's a big mess. There were the protests of the concerts, all the Christian groups outside, complaining that his lyrics were satanic and all that. People knew about Alice Cooper, whether or not they actually were into him or went to the shows. And, the Rolling Stones may have scared some of the parents a little bit, but, when you get into Alice Cooper and your kid brings home a copy of Killer that has a hanging calendar in it, puts it up on his wall, that's going to a different level than, Sticky Fingers. Number 3, just the subject matter, what he's singing about, kind of alluded to that earlier, but Dwight Frye singing about this actor who played all these villains in movies, Renfield and Dracula in particular, and he's embodying this character. He's in a mental institution, he's in a straitjacket. This theatrical stuff, not only on stage but also in the grooves of a record. He's sort of a master at that, telling those stories. He did it later on with this kid Steven, Welcome to My Nightmare. You're going into his nightmare. The whole record's kind of structured around that. But in between, he did a whole lot of that too. He's got songs like I Love the Dead and Cold Ethel that are about necrophilia, and he makes necrophilia like catchy. Listen to Cold Ethel. It can almost be a pop song. It kind of is a pop song. I don't think he released that as a single, but he wrote really catchy songs and really good songs about things that nobody else was going near. I remember being a kid and I was playing $1 Billion Babies, which is probably my favorite Alice Cooper record. And my mom came in and Marianne was playing. And those of you that know Marianne, it's kind of a little, almost like 20s or 30s kind of sounding piano number. Marianne, real innocent sounding. My mom goes, well, that's some nice music. Being a smart ass 15, I just said, well, you should stick around for the next song. It's called I Love the Dead. And she just shook her head and walked out of the room, But that's Alice Cooper, he would do that kind of stuff, and I think that he got an enormous kick out of it. And none of that was really that serious, but didn't stop people from protesting on all that at his shows. But yeah, unbelievable subject matter. He had a whole album about school. That's probably the only album of the classic lineup. That and Must Have Love, I guess, that didn't really have those horror elements or psychological horror or disturbing things. Killer has an execution at the end of it. It has a song called Dead Babies, which it actually has a serious undertone to it, like watch your kids, maybe don't let him get into those gummy bears. But yeah, he tackled really interesting subject matter that was darker and went with that image, and he was an original that way. You know, you wouldn't have Marilyn Manson, you wouldn't have Kiss, I don't think. I mean, some people would argue with that, but Alice definitely came first. The whole kind of shock rock genre, Rob Zombie, stuff like that. I think his imitators weren't nearly as good as he was, but he kind of allowed. I would stretch it further. He allowed conceptual art, in a sense, to be part of concerts and albums. I mean, you look at the packaging for these albums and just the concepts behind, you know, School's Out, Billion Dollar Babies, Welcome to My Nightmare. It's like super, super creative. I mean, I've always argued he should be on par with David Bowie in the public's perception and not lumped in with, unfortunately, a lot of like hair metal and stuff just due to some of the kind of music he puts out today. But yeah, absolutely owned that kind of style for a while, and just other people started to run off with it and do their own thing. But he was the originator that way. And number 4, he literally went to hell and back. Not only did he go to hell on his album called Alice Cooper Goes to Hell, which I think is supposed to be Steven, the character, his journey to hell and back, but Alice Cooper himself had checked into Betty Ford soon after the release of that record, wrote his follow-up record all about his alcohol stint and the people that he met in the mental institution, called From the Inside, which I think is a pretty underrated Alice Cooper record. But then, you know, even after that, he doesn't really stop. Maybe he did for a little while. And he gets into some serious, serious trouble. I mean, you just look at the photos from the early 80s with alcoholism and drugs. I think he admitted to the drugs later on. You know, there's always this kind of story you would say about how they were just like 5 dudes that were jocks that, you know, drank beer and didn't really dabble in the hard stuff. But he definitely got into that in the early 80s. You can see it from the pictures. I mean, he's just looks awful. Not like, cool, here's a shock rocker guy, Alice Cooper, doing a concert. Isn't this cool, the way he's dressing and how he looks all evil? But like a genuinely, I don't know, if I was in the audience, I would be like scared for his health. I think a lot of people were when they saw some of the interviews and possibly some of the shows. But then he changes his life. He met his wife a few years before. I think she was a big part of his sobriety. And even though when he went to church incognito and everybody rose and the Reverend Smith looked right at him and punched him in the nose, you know, he was a minister's kid. So he came back to the church, and then I think Alice, the character, kind of splintered. I think he maybe always talked in third person, but really became a big thing after he got sober for good. You know, Alice was a character he played on stage, and Alice became even more, in his words, more dangerous. There was more violence. I saw him on the Raise Your Fist and Yell tour, and that could have been a show straight out of like, I mean, it was Halloween on stage. It was murders. It was all kind. I don't know how many people like died on stage on that tour. It was brutal, and you know, maybe that's not his best album. A lot of people would say it's probably one of his worst. But man, I could not believe all the violence and gore on tour. And then you look back at videos of stuff in the 70s, and it's not quite that intense. So yeah, in his words, you know, Alice came back even meaner, even stronger, even angrier. But then, you know, he's the golfer. He's the guy that goes to church and all that stuff in his sober life. But I think the number one reason, for sure, why Alice Cooper is that his songs are just so damn good. The albums are so good. I think the original Alice Cooper band is completely underrated. I mean, I don't really care too much for Pretty's for You and Easy Action, but Love It to Death, Killer, School's Out, Billion Dollar Babies, those are just absolute classics, up there with some of the best records ever made. And then I think even, you know, Welcome to My Nightmare and Alice Cooper Goes to Hell are kind of fun to check out. From the Inside, he's still making music. He's still on stage, you know, bringing it in. And everybody that goes to Alice Cooper shows usually raves about it. He's still bringing in new fans. I saw him live about 10 years ago now, which seems crazy that it was that long ago. And it was kind of a spur of the moment thing. And I got really good tickets. And I was with my friend Joe. And I don't know that music got any better than that on that night. I mean, it was... we were so close we could see all of his mannerisms, and he was just so into the character. and it rocked and it was fun. And I guess I've seen him 3 times maybe, but that had been the first time in a long, long time, and it was probably the best time that I ever saw him too. So anyway, Alice Cooper, play him on Halloween. I've got a little mix that I made, really focusing on that early stuff. I think it's mostly those Alice Cooper band records, just the kind of scarier, darker, Halloween appropriate music. But then I stick a few songs, or quite a few off Nightmare, and then I think I've got one off Goes to Hell on there. But it'd be a good introduction to some Alice too, if you only know the hits, or School's Out and No More Mr. Nice Guy and I'm 18. All really decent songs, but there's so much more with Alice. But anyway, play some Alice on Halloween. I know I will.